My transplant doctor hid that my liver came from his dead student, then tried to have me sign a gag order in the hospital while I was hooked to IVs I didn't need. When I demanded to know why, he said, "Patient confidentiality works both ways, Marcus." I just stared at him. That was 8 months ago. This morning, he was walked out of surgery in handcuffs. I'd been getting ultrasounds every 90 days since my liver transplant 18 months ago. Same hospital, same technician, same boring procedure. My technician, Dr. Whitaker, had done over 500 transplants in his career and seen every possible complication. He was the only doctor the hospital let review transplant scans solo, believing second opinions from other specialists simply weren't necessary. But this time, I needed an MRI after my enzyme levels came back slightly elevated. I showed up that Thursday afternoon expecting the usual quick scan. Dr. Whitaker said the MRI would give us a clearer picture. Nothing to worry about. The tech got me positioned, injected the contrast dye, started the machine. Everything felt routine. She was making small talk about the weather, asking about my recovery, typical medical appointment stuff. Then Dr. Whitaker burst through the door mid-sentence while she was talking. He didn't knock, didn't announce himself, just barged in holding his tablet with my scan results. His face was completely white. He showed the screen to the tech and her whole body went rigid. She just stared at the monitor with her mouth slightly open. Dr. Whitaker told her to get every specialist in the building immediately. Then he turned to me and asked if I'd ever had any surgeries before my transplant. I told him no, just the transplant itself. He asked if I was absolutely certain. Had I ever had any procedures done abroad? Any experimental treatments? The tech whispered something about letters in the tissue, and Dr. Whitaker immediately told her to stop talking. He called in 2 other doctors, liver specialists I'd never met. They huddled around the monitor, and I heard one of them gasp and say there was actual writing imprinted on my liver. Not scarring, not damage, but writing. Like someone had somehow made the cells grow to form words. One suggested it might be surgical markings, some kind of identification system. Dr. Whitaker shot that down, said no surgeon marks organs with words. Another theorized it could be a reaction to anti-rejection drugs creating patterns that just looked like writing, but they all kept staring at the screen like they were looking at something impossible. Whatever those words said had them completely terrified. They had me stay completely still while they took image after image of the same spot. Dr. Whitaker ordered blood work immediately, checking my liver enzymes, bilirubin levels, everything. He kept asking if I'd been experiencing any pain, fatigue, or jaundice. I told him no, I felt perfectly fine. The blood work came back completely normal. Liver function tests were perfect. No signs of rejection, no elevated enzymes, nothing concerning. This seemed to disturb them more than if something had been wrong. The specialists were huddled around the screen, throwing around complex medical terms I couldn't follow, but I caught enough to understand they were amazed by the technical precision of what they were seeing. One of them kept saying this wasn't random, that whoever or whatever created these words understood advanced hepatology. One specialist whispered that this would take years of training to execute in a way that wouldn't harm the organ, if it was even possible to do intentionally. After my blood work came back normal, the questions started getting weird. Dr. Whitaker began asking things that had nothing to do with my medical history. Did I have any enemies? Has anyone ever threatened me? He wanted to know if I'd been involved in anything illegal before my transplant, if I owed anyone money. The other doctors looked uncomfortable but kept probing. They wanted details about everyone I knew with medical training. One specialist even asked if I'd ever participated in medical experiments or clinical trials I hadn't disclosed. They asked if I'd traveled anywhere unusual, if I'd had any strange encounters before my surgery. Dr. Whitaker wanted to know if anyone had access to my medical records who shouldn't have. The questions kept getting more invasive and paranoid. They were treating me like a suspect in some crime, not a patient. I was getting angry. I demanded to know what was written on my liver. They kept deflecting, saying they needed more information first. I raised my voice, said this was my body, my liver, and I had a right to know. The room went quiet. Dr. Whitaker reluctantly turned the screen toward me. There, on the surface of my liver, were 2 words formed by the liver cells themselves. Help me. The letters were about 2 centimeters tall, perfectly clear. My stomach dropped. Full panic hit me as I stared at those 2 words formed by living tissue inside my own body. Whitaker immediately ordered me admitted for emergency observation, claiming the message could mean organ failure at any moment, even though my blood work showed nothing wrong. The other specialist kept exchanging nervous looks while he insisted I needed round-the-clock monitoring. Within 20 minutes, Rebecca burst through the door, and Whitaker told her I was in critical condition despite me sitting up perfectly fine. They wheeled me to a private room and hooked me up to IVs I didn't need and monitors that beeped constantly. Rebecca held my hand while Whitaker's team ran the same blood tests over and over, all coming back normal. She kept asking why I looked fine if I was supposedly dying, but nobody would give her a straight answer. While they drew more blood, I pulled out my phone and started searching for anything about liver cells forming patterns. The nurse mentioned casually that Whitaker had canceled his 2-week vacation to personally oversee my case, which seemed weird for someone with normal test results. That first night, I couldn't sleep with all the monitors beeping and the IV drip clicking. Rebecca had fallen asleep in the chair next to my bed, her hand still holding mine. I kept thinking about Whitaker's face when he saw those words, how his fear didn't look medical but personal, like he recognized something. I wondered what someone would have to know to make liver cells grow into actual words without damaging the organ. At 6 in the morning, a woman I'd never seen walked into my room and introduced herself as Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a pediatric surgeon. She said her brother Nathan had been my liver donor, and she'd been trying to access his medical records for 18 months, but the hospital kept blocking her. She told me Nathan was only 26 and completely healthy when he died during what was supposed to be routine appendectomy surgery. Elena pulled out her phone and showed me Nathan's last text to her from the night before his surgery, saying something was wrong with the consent forms, that they'd added extra pages he didn't understand. She'd tried investigating, but Whitaker, as transplant coordinator, had sealed all of Nathan's records claiming donor confidentiality rules. She asked if I'd noticed anything unusual since getting Nathan's liver. Before I could answer, Whitaker burst through the door, his face red with rage when he saw Elena sitting next to my bed. He ordered security to escort her out immediately and threatened her with a restraining order if she came near me again. After security dragged her away, he told me Elena was mentally unstable from grief and had been harassing multiple donor families with crazy conspiracy theories. Rebecca asked why Elena would be banned from visiting when I was supposedly just another patient in the hospital. Whitaker claimed Elena had been making wild accusations about organ harvesting protocols that could damage the hospital's reputation. He increased my sedative dosage for better rest, but I palmed the pills instead of swallowing them when he watched me take them. 3 days into my hospitalization, while Rebecca went to get coffee, I searched online for Nathan Rodriguez's obituary. obituary. The bio said he was a graduate student in biomedical engineering at Case Western, specializing in tissue engineering and cellular programming. My stomach turned reading that he would have known exactly how to program cells to form specific patterns. That night, a nurse I didn't recognize slipped into my room and pressed a flash drive into my hand, whispering that Elena wanted me to see Nathan's final project presentation from school. I waited until Rebecca was asleep and plugged it into my laptop. The video showed Nathan demonstrating to his class how to use growth factors to program liver cells into forming specific patterns. He even joked about leaving cellular messages as his signature on his work. The presentation included footage of Nathan working in what looked like a research lab, not at the university, but somewhere more professional. Then Whitaker appeared in several clips, standing behind Nathan and praising his revolutionary work in cellular manipulation. The final slide showed the date of the presentation, just 3 days before Nathan's supposed emergency appendectomy that killed him. I sat there staring at the screen for a full minute before my hands started moving on their own. I forwarded the whole video to my personal email and then deleted it from the flash drive. My fingers were shaking as I cleared the browser history and closed the laptop. Rebecca was still asleep in the chair next to my bed when I heard footsteps in the hallway at exactly 7:30. Dr. Whitaker walked in with 3 residents trailing behind him like ducklings. He didn't even look at me before launching into medical speak about concerning irregularities in my latest tests. Rebecca jerked awake and immediately asked what irregularities he was talking about. He rattled off a bunch of terms about enzyme fluctuations and cellular anomalies without actually answering her question. She stood up and demanded to see these test results on his tablet. His fingers fumbled with the screen for a few seconds before he said the results were still being processed in the lab. Dr. Whitaker doing 500 transplants without anyone checking his work makes me wonder what else happens here without anyone looking twice. The way he burst in and turned white suggests he knew exactly what those words meant before he even asked about my medical history. Rebecca crossed her arms and said she wanted a second opinion from another doctor. Whitaker's jaw tightened as he explained I was too unstable to transfer to another facility. That's when I couldn't keep quiet anymore and told Rebecca about the flash drive and how Nathan had been one of Whitaker's researchers. The room went completely silent. Rebecca turned to face Whitaker with her eyes narrowed and asked why Nathan's name wasn't mentioned when we discussed the donor. Whitaker's face went white as he stammered something about lots of students rotating through his research program. Rebecca stepped closer and asked why he never mentioned this connection during 18 months of appointments. He muttered something about patient confidentiality and practically ran out of the room with his residents scrambling after him. Less than an hour later, James Mitchell showed up with a stack of papers and a fake smile. He said the hospital wanted to cover all my medical expenses if we signed some standard paperwork. Rebecca grabbed the documents and started reading while Mitchell kept talking about how the hospital valued patient satisfaction. The NDA was 12 pages long and specifically mentioned we couldn't discuss Nathan Rodriguez, cellular programming, or any theories about my transplant. Rebecca looked up from page 8 and said we weren't signing anything. Mitchell's smile disappeared as he warned us that leaving against medical advice could void my insurance coverage and transplant warranty. Rebecca pulled out her phone and started recording while pretending to text her sister. Mitchell noticed and said recording was against hospital policy before leaving with his unsigned papers. On day 5 of being stuck in the hospital, Dr. Ananya Patel arrived for the second opinion Rebecca had arranged. Whitaker tried to block her at the nurse's station, but Rebecca had already filed the paperwork making Patel my official consulting physician. Patel walked into my room carrying her own portable ultrasound equipment and immediately asked why I was hospitalized when my vitals were perfect. She reviewed my charts on her tablet and confirmed my blood work showed no signs of rejection or infection. Then she did her own scan using equipment that looked way more advanced than what the hospital had. She spent 20 minutes examining the same spot where the message appeared and confirmed the cellular writing was real. Her equipment showed something the hospital scans had missed though. Tiny cellular markers throughout my liver that spelled out NR in patterns so small you needed special imaging to see them. Nathan's initials were embedded everywhere in microscopic formations that somehow didn't affect liver function at all. Patel pulled up my medical records on 2 different systems, and her face got more confused with each screen. The test results in the hospital computer showed different numbers than the printouts Rebecca had been saving all week. Someone had been going back and changing my lab values to make it look like I needed to stay hospitalized. Patel documented everything with screenshots and said this was clear evidence of medical fraud. That night, a nurse I'd never seen before came in around midnight to check my IV. She leaned close while adjusting the bag and whispered that Whitaker had scheduled me for emergency surgery at 6 in the morning. She said the consent forms had just been delivered to the surgical floor and they were 12 pages instead of the usual 3. Her hands were shaking as she told me the surgery was listed as treatment for acute organ rejection, even though my liver was fine. Rebecca and I looked at each other and knew we had to get out immediately. We started packing our stuff at 2 in the morning while the hallway was quiet. I disconnected my IV and got dressed in regular clothes for the first time in days. We made it to the elevator before 2 security guards stepped out and blocked our path. They said Dr. Whitaker had flagged me as a psychiatric risk and I couldn't leave without his approval. Rebecca pulled out her phone and dialed 911 while I started live streaming the whole thing on my phone. The guards kept saying they were just following orders while physically blocking us from getting on the elevator. Rebecca told the 911 operator we were being held against our will at the hospital. Within minutes, our live stream had hundreds of viewers watching security guards prevent a patient from leaving. The footage spread across social media faster than I could refresh the screen. Comments started flooding in asking if we were okay and tagging local news stations while the security guards kept trying to grab my phone without actually touching me. The hospital's main entrance doors slid open and 2 Cleveland PD officers walked in. One young guy who looked fresh out of the academy and an older woman with sergeant stripes who headed straight for us. Mitchell came rushing out of the elevator looking like he'd run the whole way from his office, his tie crooked and sweat on his forehead. He started talking fast to the sergeant about a misunderstanding while the guards backed off and Rebecca showed the officers the discharge papers we'd signed earlier. The sergeant looked at the papers, then at Mitchell, then told the guards to step aside immediately. Mitchell's whole tone changed and he started apologizing, saying the hospital just wanted to make sure we understood the medical risks of leaving against their advice. He pulled out a thick stack of forms from his briefcase and said, if we'd just signed these liability waivers acknowledging we were leaving against medical counsel, we'd be free to go. Rebecca read through every page while Mitchell kept checking his watch and the live stream viewers hit 10,000. She pointed out 3 different sections that basically said we couldn't sue the hospital for anything, ever, including what we'd already experienced today. Mitchell said it was standard language, but his hands were shaking as he held the pen out to us. The younger officer started asking questions about about why the hospital thought they could physically prevent a patient from leaving, and Mitchell quickly said it was all a miscommunication with security. We signed the papers just to get out of there, and the sergeant said someone from the medical fraud unit would be in touch about our complaint. As we walked to the parking garage, a detective named Raymond Torres called my cell and said he'd watched the live stream and wanted to meet us tomorrow about the altered medical records I'd mentioned. 2 weeks later, I was sitting at our kitchen table staring at my laptop screen for the 100th time, unable to focus on work emails while my mind kept going back to those 2 words on my liver. Rebecca came in carrying her tablet and showed me something she'd found after hours of searching academic databases. Nathan Rodriguez had written his master's thesis on something called biological encryption, basically ways to encode information in living tissue that would only show up under specific medical conditions. The abstract talked about using cellular programming to create messages that could survive transplantation and remain hidden until triggered by contrast agents or specific imaging techniques. My stomach turned as I read about how he'd tested the concept on lab-grown liver tissue, successfully encoding and retrieving complex data patterns. Rebecca pointed to a section where Nathan described it as a potential way for organ donors to communicate with recipients, maybe sharing medical history or personal messages. Neither of us said what we were both thinking, that Nathan had used his own body as the messenger for something much darker. 3 days after that, Elena called through a lawyer named Patricia Chen, who said her client had information about Nathan's death that might be relevant to our situation. We met at Chen's downtown office where Elena looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't slept in weeks. She pulled out a folder full of printed emails and notes in Nathan's handwriting, spreading them across the conference table. Nathan had been tracking suspicious deaths in Whitaker's transplant program for over a year before he died, finding patterns nobody else had noticed. 3 other young, healthy grad students had died during what should have been routine procedures in the past 5 years, all at Cleveland General, all with Whitaker somehow involved even though he wasn't supposed to be their surgeon. Each one became an organ donor, and Whitaker had personally handled the transplant surgeries that followed. Elena's voice cracked as she showed us Nathan's final email to her, sent the night before his appendectomy, saying if anything happened to him, she should look for a message. Detective Torres called me the next week, saying he'd gotten a federal subpoena for Cleveland General's records, and what he'd found had the FBI involved now. He couldn't share everything, but confirmed all 4 students who'd died had been in Whitaker's research lab at some point, working on advanced biomedical engineering projects. Each one had died during routine surgeries where Whitaker appeared unexpectedly in the OR, taking over from the scheduled surgeon for educational purposes. The other 3 students had been cremated immediately after organ harvest, just like Nathan, making autopsies impossible. Torres said they were building a case, but warned it could take months of investigation before any arrests. 2 federal prosecutors joined our next meeting, asking detailed questions about everything we'd experienced and taking copies of all our medical records. They seemed especially interested in the viral live stream and how the hospital had tried to prevent us from leaving. One prosecutor, a woman named Angela Morrison, kept asking about Whitaker's behavior during the MRI discovery, wanting exact quotes of what he'd said. Rebecca turning into a legal ninja with those 12-page documents while Mitchell sweats through his fake smile is peak power move energy. Nothing says we see through your tricks like actually reading the fine print. She mentioned that Whitaker was still performing surgeries, still teaching students, still running his lab while they investigated. Without Nathan's body, she explained, proving murder would be nearly impossible since all they had was circumstantial evidence and my liver. The hospital had cremated him within 24 hours citing family consent, but Elena swore she'd never agreed to cremation. Morrison said the consent form had Elena's signature, but Elena insisted she'd only signed for organ donation, not cremation. 2 months into the investigation, I tried going back to my job at the engineering firm, but couldn't concentrate on CAD drawings, knowing I was carrying evidence of a murder inside my body. My coworkers kept whispering about the viral video, asking if I was really the guy with the message in his liver. My boss, trying to be supportive, suggested I take extended medical leave until things calmed down. Rebecca found me one night at 3 a.m. searching medical journals for ways to extract cellular messages without surgery, reading about experimental biopsies and nanoimaging techniques. She held my hands and reminded me that Nathan had died to get this message out, that destroying my liver trying to extract more evidence wouldn't help anyone. Dr. Patel called the next morning saying she'd been studying Nathan's research notes and wanted to try something at her private imaging center. Using techniques Nathan had actually described in his thesis, she adjusted the MRI parameters in ways that weren't standard protocol. The images started showing more detail, and she gasped as letters began appearing throughout my liver tissue. Not just help me, but entire paragraphs of text. Nathan had turned my liver into a biological hard drive, encoding what looked like thousands of words in the cellular structure. It took 3 sessions to image all of it, with Dr. Patel carefully documenting every section while tears ran down her face. The decoded message was Nathan's investigation journal, documenting how he'd discovered Whitaker was selecting specific students as organ donors, choosing them based on their genetic profiles and tissue compatibility with wealthy recipients. Nathan had found financial records showing millions in offshore payments coinciding with each student's death and transplant. He'd tried going to the police 6 months before his death, but without concrete proof, they'd dismissed him as paranoid. The worst part was Nathan knew he was next, writing that Whitaker had scheduled him for an appendectomy he didn't need. Nathan had spent his final weeks encoding all his evidence into his own liver cells, knowing it would be transplanted and hoping whoever received it would find the message. He'd programmed it to only appear with specific contrast agents and MRI settings, betting that eventually someone would discover it during routine screening. Elena completely broke down when we showed her the full message at Chen's office, sobbing as she read her brother's words describing how he knew he was going to die. He'd written a section just for her, telling her he loved her, and that she shouldn't blame herself for not believing his concerns about Whitaker. Nathan had tried going to the police, the FBI, even local journalists, but without proof, everyone thought he was having a mental breakdown from academic stress. He'd made his body the proof, turning himself into evidence that couldn't be destroyed or hidden. 2 days after we shared Nathan's message with prosecutors, we got served with legal papers at our front door. Whitaker was suing us for defamation, seeking $10 million in damages, and claiming we'd destroyed his reputation with baseless conspiracy theories. The hospital's lawyers filed supporting documents saying our social media stunt had damaged their entire transplant program, causing donors to withdraw consent and patients to transfer to other hospitals. They demanded an immediate gag order preventing us from discussing anything about Nathan, the liver message, or Whitaker publicly while the lawsuit proceeded. Rebecca's cousin had a law office downtown in one of those old buildings where where the elevator still had a metal gate you had to pull shut. We sat across from him while he flipped through the hospital's filing, shaking his head every few pages. He'd been practicing civil law for 15 years and told us flat out that fighting this could cost us more than $500,000 just in legal fees, win or lose. The hospital had 3 law firms on retainer and could drag this out for years. He showed us similar cases where people went bankrupt just trying to defend themselves. Rebecca asked about settling, and he pulled out the proposed agreement, 23 pages of legal language that basically meant we could never talk about Nathan, the liver message, or anything related to Whitaker ever again. That night I couldn't sleep, and the spot where Nathan's liver sat inside me started aching, this deep, throbbing pain that had no medical cause according to all my tests. Rebecca found me at 3 in the morning, hunched over my laptop watching Nathan's old research presentations on YouTube, trying to understand how someone that smart, that careful, ended up dead from a routine surgery. His videos showed him presenting at medical conferences about transplant ethics, organ allocation problems, statistical irregularities, and donor matching. He'd been building a case against something, and now I was carrying his final message. 3 days later, Elena called and said to check my email right away, but use a computer at the library, not our home network. The message had no sender name, just a video file dated 18 months ago. The timestamp showed 2:47 a.m. in the surgical wing, 3 hours before Nathan's appendectomy was scheduled. The security footage was grainy, but you could clearly see Whitaker entering the OR carrying a black medical bag that he didn't have when he left 20 minutes later. Elena had already sent it to Torres, who got a judge to sign a warrant that same afternoon. They found the bag in a storage closet that hadn't been cleaned out since the renovation. Still had Whitaker's initials on the tag. Inside were 3 vials of potassium chloride, the same drug that stops the heart during lethal injections, virtually undetectable after cremation. Torres said it was evidence, but the chain of custody was already compromised since the footage was so old, and the bag had been sitting there for over a year. Any decent lawyer could argue contamination or planted evidence. The next morning, Mitchell held a press conference announcing that Whitaker was taking a voluntary leave of absence to spend time with his family during this difficult period of harassment and false accusations. The hospital's PR team sent out statements to every major medical publication saying Whitaker was the victim of a social media witch hunt. Medical boards in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York all issued supporting statements about his impeccable record and contributions to transplant medicine. Rebecca started noticing things that week, like the same gray sedan following us to the grocery store, the doctor's office, her sister's house. Our mail started arriving already opened, envelopes carefully resealed, but you could see where they'd been steamed. I checked our internet search history and found dozens of searches we never made about paranoid delusions, mental health facilities, symptoms of psychosis. Someone was building a digital trail to make us look crazy. Ananya called the next day, her voice shaking, saying the medical board had opened an investigation into her license for performing unauthorized experimental imaging techniques. They'd suspended her pending review, which meant she couldn't practice or access any hospital systems. She said Whitaker had connections everywhere, former students, golf buddies, people who owed him favors, and they wouldn't stop until everyone involved was silenced or discredited. Elena had been going through Nathan's old files and found something that made everything worse. She'd discovered a pattern where 5 other residents who'd worked under Whitaker had died in the past 10 years, all from different causes, but all after raising concerns about his work. One had found discrepancies in his transplant success rates, where he was claiming 98% survival when the real number was closer to 70. Another noticed he was manipulating the organ allocation system to get certain patients bumped up the list, always wealthy donors to the hospital. Nathan had connected all these pieces, had been building a case file that Elena found hidden in his apartment after his death. At 3 in the morning, our security system started beeping, and the cameras showed someone in dark clothes trying to jimmy the back door lock. They ran when the alarm went off, but left something behind on the porch. Torres came out with a crime scene team, and they found a syringe filled with succinylcholine, a paralytic drug that would have left me conscious but unable to move or call for help. He increased the police patrols on our street, but said without catching someone in the act or finding fingerprints, there was no way to prove Whitaker was involved. The federal prosecutor who'd been building the case called Torres the next week to say he'd been reassigned to a terrorism task force in Detroit. His replacement was a younger prosecutor who seemed completely uninterested in pursuing anything without what he called a smoking gun, which apparently a bag of potassium chloride and security footage wasn't enough to qualify. Torres told me privately that someone with serious connections was pulling strings to protect Whitaker, that this went higher than just the hospital. I sat in my kitchen that night staring at the case files spread across the table while Rebecca made her 3rd pot of coffee since dinner. The stack of documents kept growing, but our options kept shrinking. Why would someone clever enough to encode thousands of words in liver cells schedule his own unnecessary surgery? Nathan documented everything, knew Whitaker was dangerous, yet still showed up for that appendectomy. Something about this timeline doesn't quite add up in my mind. Every lawyer we called said the same thing about going up against someone with Whitaker's connections. I grabbed Nathan's thesis again, the one Elena had given us weeks ago about cellular programming and biological data storage. Something kept bothering me about how Nathan had spent 3 whole years working on ways to encode information into living tissue. Rebecca pointed to a section she'd highlighted about time-release cellular triggers, where Nathan described how certain proteins could be programmed to change structure after specific intervals. My hands started shaking as I read his notes about 4-month activation periods for secondary message displays. We drove to Elena's apartment at midnight, and she pulled up Nathan's research files on her laptop. The formulas showed how he designed multi-stage encoding that would reveal different information as the transplanted cells aged and integrated with the host tissue. Elena called Dr. Patel, who agreed to run new imaging tests first thing in the morning using the specific wavelengths Nathan had noted in his research. The MRI tech looked confused when Dr. Patel gave her the unusual settings, but followed the instructions exactly. I lay in that machine for 2 hours while they scanned every angle of my liver using Nathan's specifications. Dr. Patel's face went pale as new patterns appeared on the monitor that hadn't shown up in any previous scans. She zoomed in on what looked like a list forming in the cellular structure itself. 6 names appeared clearly in the tissue, each followed by dates spanning the past 5 years. Elena gasped and grabbed my arm when she recognized 2 of the names as Nathan's former lab partners, who had died in what everyone thought were accidents. The other 4 names were students currently working in Whitaker's research program, and one of them, Jennifer Park, was scheduled for gallbladder surgery at Cleveland General next week. Dr. Patel printed the images while Elena frantically tried calling the students on the list. 3 didn't answer, but Jennifer picked up on the 5th ring, sounding groggy and confused. Elena told her not to have the surgery and to meet us immediately at a coffee shop downtown. Jennifer showed up 20 minutes later looking terrified and clutching her phone like a lifeline. She said Whitaker had been her mentor for 4 years and controlled every aspect of her career, including her residency placement and research funding. When Elena showed her the images from my liver, Jennifer started crying and pulled out her phone to play us recordings she'd been making secretly for months. Whitaker's voice came through the speaker, making comments about how accidents could happen to ungrateful students who didn't follow his guidance. In one recording from just last week, he mentioned how Nathan had thought he was too smart for his own good, and look where that got him. Jennifer had 17 recordings total, each one containing subtle threats disguised as career advice or medical warnings. Torres listened to all of them that afternoon and immediately said this was bigger than local police could handle. He drove us to the FBI field office in downtown Cleveland, where we waited 3 hours to meet with Agent Sarah Coleman. Coleman was a thin woman in her 40s who took notes on a yellow legal pad while we explained everything from the beginning. She had us play Jennifer's recordings twice and studied the liver images with a magnifying glass. Coleman said she'd seen cases like this before, where brilliant criminals left just enough doubt to avoid prosecution. Without physical evidence or a surviving witness to attempted murder, she explained, even the FBI would struggle to build a solid case. She assigned 2 agents to start investigating, but warned us not to expect quick results, since Whitaker had been careful to keep his hands clean. Rebecca and I hadn't been sleeping more than 3 hours a night by this point, and it was taking a toll on both of us. She'd lost 15 pounds in 5 weeks, and her principal had called me twice about her seeming distracted during classes. We sat in our living room one night, seriously discussing witness protection, weighing whether our safety was worth abandoning the fight for Nathan's justice. Rebecca kept saying we couldn't let Whitaker kill more students, but I could see the fear in her eyes every time a car drove slowly past our house. Jennifer agreed to help us gather more evidence by wearing a wire to her pre-surgery consultation with Whitaker, who had returned from administrative leave claiming complete vindication. The FBI tech taped the tiny microphone under her collar and tested the transmission range from a van parked outside the hospital. Jennifer's hands shook as she walked into Whitaker's office, but she kept her voice steady when she asked if the gallbladder surgery was really necessary. Whitaker's response made my blood run cold as he talked about how Nathan had been brilliant with his cellular programming and biological encryption work. He said Nathan thought he was clever, but didn't realize that Whitaker had taught him everything he knew about manipulating living tissue. The recording captured every word, including Whitaker's comment that students who questioned his medical judgment often developed sudden complications during routine procedures. It wasn't a full confession, but Coleman said it was the closest thing to evidence they'd gotten so far. The hospital board announced their own investigation the next week, claiming it would be completely independent and thorough. The 3 doctors they appointed to lead it had all trained under Whitaker at various points in their careers. They interviewed us in a conference room with Mitchell taking notes in the corner and asking leading questions designed to make us look paranoid. The investigators spent more time questioning our mental health and motivations than examining the actual evidence we'd collected. One of them suggested the liver messages could be elaborate hallucinations caused by anti-rejection medication, even though 3 different doctors had confirmed the images. They asked if we had any history of conspiracy theories or if we'd ever filed false reports against medical professionals before. After 2 weeks of these interviews, they issued a preliminary statement saying they'd found no evidence of wrongdoing by Dr. Whitaker or any hospital staff. That night, I found Rebecca sobbing in what used to be our spare bedroom, but was now covered wall to wall with timelines, documents, and photos of Nathan. She'd created a massive investigation board with red string connecting different pieces of evidence and yellow sticky notes marking important dates. Rebecca kept saying she could feel Nathan's presence in that room, like he was pushing us to keep going when everyone else wanted us to give up. She'd printed every page of his thesis and highlighted sections about cellular messaging and tissue programming that might contain more clues. The room smelled like old coffee and printer ink, and I counted at least 40 empty cups stacked on the desk. Rebecca had been spending 6 hours a night in there after work, going through every detail again and again looking for something we'd missed. 3 weeks later, Elena called me at 2 in the morning saying she'd found something huge. Her voice was shaking and she kept repeating that we needed to meet right away. I threw on clothes and drove to the all-night diner on Carnegie, where she was already waiting in a back booth with a laptop bag clutched against her chest. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her hands were trembling as she pulled out an old MacBook covered in programming stickers. She said Nathan's roommate had been storing it in his closet for the past 2 years, thought it was broken, but Elena managed to get it working. The screen flickered to life, showing dozens of folders labeled with dates and medical terms. Elena clicked through file after file of screenshots, bank statements, encrypted messages between Whitaker and buyers around the world. Nathan had been documenting everything for months before his death. There were spreadsheets tracking organ recipients, their payments, the students who died. One folder contained cryptocurrency wallet addresses, with transaction histories showing over $30 million flowing through various accounts. Elena's brother had screenshots of Whitaker's private emails discussing prices for hearts, kidneys, lungs, even corneas. The buyers were CEOs, politicians, tech billionaires from China, Russia, Saudi Arabia. Nathan had recorded phone conversations where Whitaker bragged about his perfect system, how the hospital protected him, how no one would ever catch him. Agent Coleman arrived within an hour after Elena called him. He sat there scrolling through the evidence with his mouth hanging open. He kept muttering about RICO charges and international trafficking while copying everything onto federal drives. Coleman said this was bigger than just murder now. This was organized crime crossing state and international borders. He started making calls to the Financial Crimes Unit, waking up prosecutors and forensic accountants. Within days, Coleman had a team of agents tracing every transaction through shell companies in Panama, the Cayman Islands, Switzerland. They found accounts under fake names that traced back to Whitaker and Mitchell through small mistakes in the paperwork. The money trail was cleaner than trying to prove murder. Financial crimes left digital fingerprints everywhere. Coleman said they could get 20 years just on the money laundering alone. That Saturday at midnight, I woke up to someone pounding on our front door so hard the whole frame was shaking. Whitaker was standing on our porch, swaying drunk, his eyes bloodshot and wild. He started screaming that Nathan was too smart for his own good, that we should stop digging unless we wanted to join him. Nathan's laptop coming back from the dead with $30 million worth of receipts is quite the plot twist. Guess he encrypted more than just liver cells. Rebecca grabbed her phone to call 911 while I hit record on mine. Whitaker kept ranting about how we didn't understand what we were messing with, how powerful his connections were. He said the hospital would protect him like they always had. He kicked our door hard enough to crack the wood before stumbling back to his Mercedes. The cops arrived 8 minutes later and found him passed out in his car 2 blocks away. Tuesday. They arrested him for harassment, making threats, and drunk driving. At the station, his lawyer showed up within an hour claiming Whitaker was having a mental breakdown from our persecution. The judge set bail at $50,000, which Whitaker paid immediately. His lawyer got a mutual restraining order saying we both had to stay away from each other. 3 days later, Coleman called to say Jennifer, the medical student who'd agreed to wear a wire, was backing out. Another student from Whitaker's program had been in a car accident that morning. His car went off the road into a tree and he was paralyzed from the waist down. The brake lines looked cut but couldn't be proven. Jennifer was terrified. She said she had a daughter to think about. Coleman couldn't force her and couldn't prove the accident was connected. Everyone knew it was a message, but knowing and proving were different things. I went in for my regular liver check the next month, and Dr. Patel noticed something strange on the ultrasound. New patterns were forming in the tissue, cellular arrangements that hadn't been there before. She called in 2 other specialists who stared at the screen in amazement. The cells were forming numbers and letters clear as day. It looked like someone had written bank account numbers and passwords directly into my liver tissue. Patel said this was impossible, but there it was on the screen. Nathan had programmed time release information into the cellular structure. Coleman nearly fell out of his chair when I showed him the images. The account numbers led to banks in Switzerland and the passwords worked. The FBI's financial team accessed accounts with detailed records going back 8 years. Whitaker had documented every illegal transplant like he was keeping books for a business. Each file had the donor's name, how they died, who got the organs, how much they paid. There were emails negotiating prices, arranging deaths to match recipient schedules. One file made my stomach drop. It showed I was never supposed to get Nathan's liver. A tech billionaire named Chen had paid $5 million for it, but Nathan's cellular programming had made the organ appear incompatible with everyone except me on the matching system. The tissue samples showed markers that would only match my exact profile. Nathan had hacked his own liver to choose his recipient. He'd researched transplant patients and picked someone he thought would fight for justice. The FBI arrested Mitchell at his country club during Sunday brunch. He folded immediately, offering to testify against Whitaker for a reduced sentence. Mitchell admitted they'd killed at least 12 students over 8 years, maybe more. He had records of bribes to coroners, payments to silence families, threats against anyone who asked questions. Mitchell said Whitaker picked students with no close family, international students whose deaths wouldn't be investigated closely. Sitting in Coleman's office looking at all the evidence, I finally understood what Nathan had done. He'd turned his own body into a weapon against his killers. He knew he was going to die and programmed his liver to find someone who would expose everything. He'd researched my background, saw I'd worked as a journalist before getting sick. Nathan chose me to finish what he started. The weight of that choice made me dizzy. This kid had given me life twice, once with his liver and again with his message. 8 months passed before the FBI finally moved on our evidence. I was eating breakfast when Rebecca showed me her phone with a news alert about arrests at Cleveland General. The video showed agents walking Whitaker out of the hospital in handcuffs while he was still wearing his surgical scrubs. 3 other doctors got arrested that same morning, along with 2 hospital administrators. The hospital put out a statement within hours saying they had no knowledge of any illegal organ sales. Elena called me right after the arrests to say we needed to be at the arraignment together. The courtroom was packed with reporters when Whitaker stood before the judge 2 days later. His lawyer argued the whole case was based on impossible science fiction about programmed cells. The judge set bail at $5 million, and Whitaker posted it within an hour. The prosecution started building their case by bringing in the country's top cellular biology experts. One professor from Johns Hopkins spent 3 hours explaining how Nathan's technique worked to encode information in living tissue. Another expert from Stanford called it biological genius that Nathan turned his own murder into evidence. The federal courthouse in downtown Cleveland became our second home over the next few weeks. Mitchell took the stand first and described exactly how the organ selling network operated for over a decade. He explained how Whitaker would find brilliant medical students, steal their research, then arrange accidents to harvest their organs. Elena sat next to me crying as Mitchell described Nathan's final hours in detail. Rebecca and I testified the following week about finding the messages in my liver during the MRI. Whitaker's lawyer tried making us look crazy, asking if we believed in alien abductions or government conspiracies. The prosecutor showed the jury enlarged images of the actual liver cells spelling out, "Help me." 2 months into the trial, a young woman nobody recognized entered the courtroom to testify. She told the jury Whitaker had assaulted her and threatened to kill her if she ever spoke up. She played recordings she'd secretly made of Whitaker describing how he murdered Nathan while trying to scare her into silence. The prosecution's next piece of evidence made everyone in the courtroom gasp. They played a video Nathan recorded the night before his death explaining his cellular encoding process in detail. Nathan looked straight at the camera and said if anyone was watching this, Whitaker had killed him. He said the evidence was in his liver and asked whoever received it to find Marcus Williams. Whitaker's lawyer told him not to testify, but he took the stand anyway, too arrogant to stay quiet. He claimed Nathan was delusional, and the cellular patterns were just natural anomalies that meant nothing. Under cross-examination, he started talking about details of Nathan's surgery that only the killer would know. The defense brought their own experts who insisted cellular programming was impossible, but they fell apart under questioning. When asked to explain the mathematical precision of the patterns in my liver, they had no answers. One expert admitted on the stand that the defense paid him $500,000 for his testimony. During a recess near the end of the trial, I was walking past Whitaker in the hallway when I heard him talking. He told his lawyer that Nathan deserved what happened for being too clever for his own good. His lawyer reminded him people could hear them in the courthouse, and Whitaker just laughed. He said it didn't matter anymore because the jury would never believe cells could store messages. The next morning, both lawyers stood before the jury for closing arguments. The prosecutor held up photos of Nathan and 11 other victims, while describing how Whitaker had murdered brilliant young people to harvest their organs. She showed the jury Nathan's encoded liver cells on the big screen and explained how this genius had sacrificed himself to expose a killer. She walked them through each victim's suspicious death and the matching organ recipients who'd paid millions under the table. The defense attorney tried to paint Whitaker as a scapegoat for hospital failures and claimed the cellular patterns were just random formations. He said Nathan died from surgical complications, and any message was pure coincidence that desperate people were misinterpreting. The jury left to deliberate, and Rebecca, Elena, and I checked into a hotel across from the courthouse to wait. Elena pulled out photo albums and told us stories about Nathan growing up, how he'd taught himself programming at 8 years old. She showed us puzzles he'd created as a kid and science fair projects where he programmed bacteria to spell words. She said Nathan always believed science should help people and spent weekends volunteering at free clinics. Rebecca held my hand as Elena described finding Nathan's body at the hospital and knowing something was wrong. We ordered room service, but nobody could eat much while waiting waiting for the verdict. 3 days passed with the jury still deliberating, and we took turns pacing the hotel room. On the third evening, the court clerk called to say the jury had reached a verdict. We rushed back to the packed courtroom where victims' families filled every seat. The judge asked the jury foreman to read the verdict, and my heart pounded as he stood up. Guilty on all 12 counts of murder, guilty on organ trafficking, guilty on conspiracy charges. The courtroom exploded with families crying and hugging while Whitaker sat completely still without any expression. Mitchell started sobbing at the defense table and had to be helped out by security guards. A month later, we returned for sentencing where 23 family members gave victim impact statements. A mother described her son's perfect health before his appendix surgery and the call saying he died from complications. A wife explained how her husband went in for gallbladder surgery and never came home despite being a marathon runner. Parents showed photos of their brilliant children who'd mysteriously died during routine procedures at Whitaker's hospital. Whitaker showing up drunk at their door feels too convenient, like someone that careful suddenly loses all control. The timing of that student's car accident right when Jennifer was about to wear a wire makes me wonder who else knows about this investigation besides Coleman's team. I stood up and read the statement Nathan had encoded in smaller cellular patterns we'd found later in my liver. He'd written about seeing Whitaker inject something into patients and realizing he was choosing victims for their organs. He described encoding the message knowing it was his only chance to get justice from beyond the grave. The judge sentenced Whitaker to 12 consecutive life sentences without any possibility of parole. As guards led him away in chains, Whitaker turned to look directly at me and mouthed the words, "Nathan won." It was the only time he'd ever admitted what really happened to Nathan and the others. The hospital immediately settled hundreds of lawsuits for $800 million while refusing to admit any wrongdoing. 6 administrators resigned, and the entire transplant program was placed under federal oversight for the next decade. Elena and I drove to the cemetery together on a sunny Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after the trial. She placed white roses on Nathan's headstone and thanked him for being brave enough to stop a monster. I promised Nathan I'd spend whatever years I had left making sure his story was told everywhere. I told him about the medical students learning about his cellular programming technique and how it would save lives. Dr. Patel got her license back and published Nathan's technique in the New England Journal of Medicine with him as lead author. She showed how cells could be programmed to store complex information without damaging organ function, revolutionizing both data storage and forensic science. 3 more doctors from other hospitals were arrested when investigators found connections to Whitaker's organ trafficking network. Nathan's evidence became the key to exposing a nationwide conspiracy that had killed over 40 patients for their organs. Rebecca and I used our settlement money to create the Nathan Foundation for Medical Ethics. We funded oversight programs at teaching hospitals and helped families investigate suspicious medical deaths that had been ignored. The foundation's first grant went to Elena's research lab, where she was developing new ways to detect cellular programming in transplant organs. Every night, I'd wake up at 3 a.m. drenched in sweat, feeling Nathan's words burning inside my liver like they were still being written. Rebecca would wrap her arms around me and whisper that we'd given him justice while I shook against her chest. The nightmares got so bad I started sleeping in the guest room to avoid waking her every night. Jennifer called us 2 months later from her first day at medical school, crying as she told us how she'd stood up in ethics class and shared what Whitaker had done to her family. She started volunteering at our foundation on weekends, helping other families navigate the medical system and spot warning signs we'd all missed. The documentary crew spent 3 days in our living room filming interviews, then flew to interview Elena and 12 other families whose loved ones had died under Whitaker's care. When it aired on national television 6 months later, Whitaker's former colleagues finally broke their silence about the signs they'd ignored for years. One surgeon admitted he'd noticed unusual death patterns, but never reported them because Whitaker brought millions in grants to the hospital. The medical board held emergency sessions for 3 weeks straight before announcing new oversight requirements they called Nathan's Law. Every transplant program would now require mandatory second opinions and external reviews, ending the era of solo decision-making that had let Whitaker operate unchecked. Elena called me sobbing one afternoon after finding a hidden file in Nathan's old laptop labeled, "If you're reading this." Inside was a document dated 2 days before his surgery, where Nathan wrote that if someone was reading this, he was gone. But ideas don't die and justice doesn't die, thanking whoever was listening when he couldn't speak. The news about Mitchell came through Detective Torres, who called to tell me another inmate had attacked him in the federal prison shower with a makeshift knife. The attacker's son had died during routine surgery at Mitchell's hospital 5 years ago under suspicious circumstances. Mitchell survived, but the blade severed his spinal cord, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down and confined to a wheelchair for life. The FBI agent handling Whitaker's financial crimes discovered he'd been moving money to cryptocurrency accounts for months before his arrest. They found plane tickets to Thailand dated for 3 days after Nathan's message appeared on my scan, meaning Nathan's evidence had stopped his escape by less than 72 hours. The medical ethics board wanted to preserve some of Nathan's encoded cells for their permanent archives as proof of what had happened. I went in for the biopsy on a Tuesday morning, watching them extract a tiny piece of my liver containing Nathan's message, while tears ran down my face. The procedure took 20 minutes, but I sat in the recovery room for 2 hours, unable to stop thinking about how I was literally giving part of Nathan to history. Rebecca picked me up afterward and held my hand the whole drive home before telling me she was pregnant. After everything we'd been through, creating new life felt like the universe giving us something back, and we decided right there that if it was a boy, we'd name him Nathan. 3 weeks later, during my regular follow-up scan, Dr. Patel called in 2 other specialists to look at the monitor. The cellular messages were changing on their own, Nathan's final program activating as new words slowly formed beneath the original "help me" message. Over the next hour, we watched the cells rearrange themselves to spell out, "Thank you, Marcus, I'm free now," before the encoding began breaking down. Dr. Patel explained that Nathan must have programmed the cells to self-destruct after delivering their final message, ensuring no trace would remain once justice was served. 3 weeks after the trial ended, we held a memorial service at the cathedral downtown for everyone Whitaker had killed. Over 400 people showed up, including dozens of medical students from the university who stood in the back holding candles. The dean of the medical school gave a speech about how the entire medical community had failed these families by protecting one of their own instead of protecting patients. Elena sat in the front row with 20 other families who'd lost someone to Whitaker's organ harvesting scheme. After the service, she started meeting with them every Tuesday at the community center, creating a support group where they could share their stories and help each other heal. She told me later that helping these families gave her brother's death meaning, that Nathan would have wanted something good to come from all this pain. Meanwhile, Meanwhile, the cellular messages in my liver were slowly breaking down exactly as Nathan had programmed them to do. Dr. Patel ran scans every 2 weeks to monitor the process, watching as the encoded cells gradually returned to normal tissue. By the 4th month after the trial, the last traces of the message had completely faded, leaving behind perfectly healthy liver cells that functioned exactly as they should. Nathan had made sure his final gift would last, that the organ he'd given me would keep working long after his message had served its purpose. Rebecca went back to teaching 3rd grade while I returned to my accounting job, but we weren't the same people anymore. We questioned doctors more, asked for second opinions, made sure we understood every procedure before agreeing to anything. 6 months after the trial, our son was born healthy and perfect, 10 fingers and 10 toes, and a strong set of lungs he used to announce his arrival. Elena drove up from Columbus to be there, and when we asked her to be his godmother, she cried and said Nathan would have loved being an uncle. I started volunteering at the hospital 2 days a week, sitting with transplant patients and making sure they knew their rights, understood their options, had someone to advocate for them if they needed it. The hallways where Whitaker once walked like he owned the place now had patient advocates in every department, people whose only job was to protect patients from doctors who might abuse their power. The foundation Elena created in Nathan's name raised $3 million in its first year to fund research into cellular programming for legitimate medical purposes. Scientists at Johns Hopkins used Nathan's technique to identify organs from trafficking victims, while researchers in Germany developed a way to mark donated organs that could help track them if they were ever stolen or sold illegally. The medical student who'd helped crack Nathan's code, Jennifer Park, graduated at the top of her class and chose to specialize in transplant medicine. She told the newspaper she wanted to restore faith in a field that Whitaker had corrupted, that Nathan's story had shown her how important it was to have ethical doctors who put patients first. 2 years after finding that first message in my liver, I was sitting at my desk when I felt a strange warmth spread through my right side where Nathan's organ rested. Not pain or discomfort, just a gentle warmth like someone had placed a heating pad against my skin from the inside. Dr. Patel said it was probably nothing, maybe just increased blood flow from the coffee I'd been drinking, but I knew better. Some connections run deeper than medicine can explain. Some bonds survive even death. On our son's first birthday, we planted an oak tree in our backyard while Elena watched him take his wobbly first steps across the grass. She'd brought a small plaque that read, "For Nathan Rodriguez, whose truth could not be silenced," and we buried it next to the roots. That tree will grow tall and strong over the years, its roots spreading deep into the earth, a living reminder that some messages find a way to surface no matter how deep they're buried. Every spring when new leaves appear, I'll remember the man who saved my life twice, first with his liver and then with his warning. Nathan's message had done what he intended, exposed a killer and saved future victims. But more than that, it had shown us that even in death, the truth has a way of making itself heard. All right, time for me to clock out and let you soak in all this brilliance. Thanks for letting me be your commentary buddy today. Subscribe for more content like this.